Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're just letting people in from the waiting room, and then we'll be getting going with this afternoon's webinar. As you're joining us, I'll just do the words of welcome so you know what you're coming into and what to expect from this session. So thank you for joining us as part of the London Funders Festival of Learning. I'm James from the London Funders team. It's fantastic to have you all with us this afternoon. As you'll know, if you've been to sessions across the week so far, you'll know that we're bringing people together for reflections, for learning, for insights from the last year. And we're hoping that that can serve as a springboard for discussion and action as well in the funding community as we head towards what we hope is a recovery and renewal period ahead. Through these sessions, we're hoping to capture the best of what we've done together, amplify that, and build a movement for positive and progressive change here in London, and also to influence funding behaviours beyond London as well. This session is coming to you with the GLA and with Locality, and is looking at the Community Spaces at Risk Fund. Now, this is work that's been really important over the last year. It's been about blending and balancing some of the emergency needs of funding for the sector with looking ahead to the longer term recovery of these spaces. You'll know hopefully from research that Locality did last year, which is in the COVID-19 Resource Hub on the London Funders website, about the challenges that community spaces, community anchors, community centres, community hubs were facing over the last year. You'll also know how vital those hub spaces are for wider agendas of tackling isolation, supporting mental health and resilience, as well as access to vital services. And I think if any of us ever doubted, as I'm sure you didn't, but if you ever doubted the importance of local community groups, the importance of local community spaces before the pandemic, surely we've all seen the power of them through this and can also see what a key role they're going to play in the recovery that's ahead. So it's fantastic to be joined by David from Locality and Raja from the GLA to share their learning and their plans for the future. Before handing over to them, I just need to let you know that on a practical level, this is a webinar format, so you can only sadly see the three of us on screen and we can't see your friendly faces, but you can chat to each other to share resources and insights in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And if you've got questions you'd like to ask during the session, if you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, I'll be able to see those and come to those when we get to the Q&A session. If you're looking in the Q&A box and you see questions that you wanted to ask, but somebody else has already got there first, you can use the thumbs up button just to vote for that question to get to the top of the list and make sure that we ask it in the Q&A session that follows. I think the last thing I have to say, and I'll be told off if I don't say it, is that if you're on social media, we'd also encourage you to follow us on Twitter at London Funders and share your learning during the session using the hashtag LondonLearnFest. And we'll also be producing a summary of this session and all of the sessions over the week to bring together the learning after the festival that we'll share with you as well. So I'll hand over now to hear from David and from Raja, and I'll be back later with you in the session to go through your questions with them. I'm really looking forward to this and to learning with you together.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And can everyone see, can I just confirm that you can see the screen?
Yes, thanks, Roger.
Great, wonderful. Okay, so I will quickly kick off. So the Community Spaces at Risk Fund is a new partnership between the Mayor's Culture at Risk Office and Locality. My name is Raja Moussaoui. I'm a Senior Policy Officer leading the Culture at Risk Policy area, which sits within the Culture and Creative Industries unit at the Mayor's Office. And I'll take you through the first few slides here. So today we're going to be talking about an overview of the fund, sharing with you some data that we've collected on the first cohort of support that we've already undertaken. So we are running this fund in 2 rounds. The second one is now active and we've just completed the first round. David will be sharing with you some case studies on some of the work that we've done, and we'll be sharing some learnings and reflections, and then inviting questions, of course. So just as a little bit of an introduction to the Mayor's Culture at Risk Office, it was established in 2016 with a remit to protect cultural infrastructure based on kind of demands that we heard from Londoners about valuable spaces across the city, cultural spaces that were at risk of being lost. So we provide expertise and advice and facilitation and offer essentially a bespoke service to cultural operators and both cultural production and cultural I'm saying production and also performance spaces. So everything from, maker spaces to theatres. And we work directly with businesses, cultural organizations, and also community groups who are sort of active on the ground trying to safeguard and campaign for the safeguarding of spaces. But we're really keen to not just deal with acute emergency issues, but think about ways to expand that into securing spaces for the future and to work on organizational sustainability too. These are some of the services that we typically provide, but really everything is different on a case-by-case basis. But we try to use the influence that we have from City Hall to lobby decision makers. We often intervene in the planning system and write representations, including when cases come forward that are at risk as a result of development. And in some cases, when they're not referable to the mayor's office, we might come from a specific perspective, from a cultural community's perspective, to offer some evidence and expertise around what is important to save in the context of that development coming forward. So we'll negotiate Section 106 agreements, have conversations with parties, mediate disputes at sometimes, convene stakeholders, form strategic relationships. And a lot of the time we are looking for partnerships with other sector specific partners or groups like Locality, who have specialisms in capacity building support, to come around as a coalition to support organizations and ensure that the spaces that are valuable to Londoners are saved. So in the context of the crisis, we understood that there was a need, as David identified at the top of the presentation, for this kind of infrastructure-based support to be extended to community spaces as well. So we knew, for instance, through research that was coming from London Survey and research that we were doing through the Culture at Risk Office, that there was disproportional impact on spaces that were diverse-led, and that there was inadequate existing funding and support provisions for target organizations, especially those led by and serving underrepresented groups. And so we, in speaking to our other colleagues in other policy areas and those who are leading recovery missions to the GLA in partnership with stakeholders across the city and London councils, decided to expand the Culture at Risk Office remit in order to deliver across a series of different kind of objectives for London's recovery. The fund, we aligned with the Wave 4 and Wave 5 of the London Community Response Fund. And as an aligned fund, we adopted the same criteria for the kind of organizations that were prioritized for that round of funding. The aligned fund, just our fund, really focused on space-based issues, so securing premises for organizations that were responding to those who were most impacted by the crisis. So we really wanted to make sure that in addition to program funding, especially in the first round of Wave 4, that we were ensuring that the spaces that the great work that these organizations were doing, the spaces they were doing it in, were not at risk, because we understood that they were often working at huge capacity, and that premises-based issues, leases and other things sometimes go by the wayside because of other immediate priorities that have to be taken into consideration. So we aligned around the same priorities, which included equity and inclusion, strong local connections, and prioritization for smaller organizations. This is a little process diagram of what we have undertaken in terms of the user journey for those who apply for the fund. So folks apply to the Community Spaces at Risk Fund through the LCRF portal, in addition to the application that they would have taken on with the general pooled funding. And then we undertake a separate diagnostic process to determine who might be best positioned for the Community Spaces at Risk Fund support. We worked with Locality on the appraisal process to select the cohort. We have a multidisciplinary project board, so policy officers from across the regeneration, community social policy, and culture teams. Then there is the specialist support offer that's undertaken, led by Locality. And then our project board reviews grant recommendations that we make, and then we go into our evaluation process. Now I'm going to pass over to David.
Thanks, Raja. I'm kind of hoping that most people know who Locality is, but I'll explain anyway. I'm David Moynihan, by the way. I'm Head of Services at Locality. We're a national organisation and a membership body, and our role is to support community organisations to be strong and successful, and we do that through peer-to-peer support between community organisations. We do a lot of kind of policy and lobbying work with government funders and the rest, and we also do a lot of capacity building support with community organisations, as I say, to get them to be stronger and successful. But we also bring quite a lot of experience around community assets, and we've worked on several community assets program. I led one funded by MHCLG called the Community Enabler Fund, which was all about kind of helping community organisations commandeer assets that are kind of asset community value listed. And we've also got some experience of running grant and business support blended programs. So we've done that with City Bridge Trust. I gathered there was a kind of session last week on City Bridge Trust. And we've also done that with Bright Ideas as well, which is more about new community businesses. So we kind of understand the kind of nature of combining those two activities. In terms of our role on this, as Raja mentioned, we played a role in the kind of decision-making process. So I guess in that respect, we were helping assess the risk of many of these community spaces. And in some cases, it was about the business continuity of the organisation itself. So if the community organisation goes under, the space goes under. And in other cases, it was more about kind of relationships with landlords and a threat to the space on its own. We also helped with the kind of the business support part of the package. Once the sort of diagnostic and needs assessment process had taken place, and that had given us an indication of the kind of support that each organisation needed, our team went out on a kind of one-to-one basis to work with these organisations to deliver that support. And we also took on the kind of grant management aspect of the programme as well. Back over to you, Raja.
Thanks, David. So building on what David was saying, we teamed up to go through the scoring process in the first round and prioritized a set of, I suppose, objectives that we knew were going to help us reach the sort of organizations that we had set out to, and in consultation with all of our policy leads in different teams who were working with us on the design of the program. So what we prioritized were at-risk spaces that are used to deliver public-facing work that is vital to and valued by local communities. Spaces that support social integration. So we, our colleagues in the social integration team have developed a social integration toolkit that looks at different factors in measuring social integration in spaces. So we were applying some of the learnings from that research to this program and asking applicants to kind of comment on the sort of way that they use the spaces in terms of relationships, enabling local participation and tackling inequalities. Another criteria point for us was that we were looking to support organizations who are well established in their local area. So not just, I suppose, length of time, but if there was a specific kind of cultural heritage value to the space that they were occupying, we're really trying to ascertain, both local need and also why the space itself might hold particular value to a particular community. We are also looking at contribution to community resilience. So we looked at a series of different kind of data matrices data metrics to try and understand this on top of the kind of reflections that were shared to us with organizations. So we use data as a, I suppose, mediating force in kind of making difficult decisions about organizations and spaces that were critical to community resilience. And then we also looked at the nature of the risk and tried to apply it against if it was genuine risk that the program could meaningfully address. So this is the application sort of data in numbers from our first cohort. So in terms of percentages, the great majority were community centers, followed by voluntary centers and then art centers. And I think you can see the rest. And in terms of the key issues that were identified by organizations, we can see that rent payments and lease negotiations and needing to support with business planning and sustainability rank the highest. So those kind of three issues were reflected as well in the insights from our needs assessment. So as I said, there was kind of a multi-step process that we took in order to identify how we could build the right support package for each organization. They first went through a diagnostic kind of process. And then we, as individual caseworkers from the Culture at Risk office, spoke to them and went through a needs assessment process where they were able to give us some contextual kind of background on the reasons that they faced the risk that they were facing, whether these were kind of historic issues or if they were specific to the crisis. And we co-designed the support program with them and ensured that they were signed up to it. And then we would have consultations with our full team with Locality to decide the offer. And it was, in some cases, it was more appropriate for, the Culture at Risk office to perhaps intervene if we were able to make connections in local authorities or with decision makers, then we might do that. Sometimes it was a partnership between ourselves and Locality on an individual case, and then sometimes it was just more appropriate for Locality to take that on. So we kind of assess that on a case-by-case basis. So I think specific to the fact that we were looking at smaller based organizations, those with lived experience, targeting groups that were most impacted by the crisis, we saw some consistent risks across some of the needs assessments that we took. So a lot of the time, these really small organizations lacked visibility to their local authorities. They didn't necessarily have the same kind of, I suppose, social capital or lobbying power that some other organizations might have. Many of them had insecure leases and limited access to property expertise. So nobody is surprised that property lawyers are quite expensive and not always ready at hand. So a lot of times we were talking to folks about their governance as well, the kind of skills audits that they have in their governance team, if they have anybody who's advising them typically on property related issues. Many of them expressed a sense of powerlessness and a lack of control in terms of, having to work really, really hard during the crisis to address the needs in their local community, whilst also facing like existential issues around the future of their organization and the risk of loss to space. And I think I've mentioned that, but the key support needs that kept consistently coming up were, insecure leases, so future lease negotiations, needs a need to broker relationship with local authorities to ensure future sustainability and advice on fundraising and alternative finance, as well as just some general advocacy for both funding applications and also in terms of decision making or in terms of relationships with decision makers about the future of them operating out of their spaces. I think we've kind of touched on this, just a breakdown of the cohort in numbers and the needs assessments. So most of the organizations that we were worked with in our first cohort were supporting people at risk, but also lots of people who were providing food security during the crisis, those who focused on equity and inclusion, mental health, children and young people. And this is a sort of demographic breakdown of the kind of lived experiences that the organizations who we're supporting represented, and also the kind of folks that they were helping to support. So that included Black, Asian, minority, ethnic-led organizations, deaf and disabled-led organizations, LGBTQ+ organizations, and women-led organizations. We noted that from our first cohort of 41 organizations, we were supporting spaces across 16 16 of London's boroughs. And we're just wrapping up the second round of appraisals for our upcoming cohort and looking at the kind of geographic spread as well to understand if we have a fair distribution across the city. I'm going to pass over to David now.
Thanks, Raja. So as well as doing the kind of one-to-one business support, we also kind of identified some opportunities where we could do one-to-many support to organisations. And once we had the kind of needs assessments and we could see some commonalities across the cohort, we ran 3 webinars. Actually 3 webinars. 2 of them to do with funding, so successful fundraising and alternative finance. So by alternative finance, we get them to look at social investment, community shares, and crowdfunding, as well as the usual stuff about putting a fundraising strategy together and writing a high quality bid. But we also did a session on protecting community assets, so using legislative tools like assets of community value, neighbourhood planning, and all the rest in terms of protecting spaces for the longer term. And the National Lottery also ran a kind of funding webinar as well. And we plan to kind of continue these webinars, for the next wave, looking at things like building relationships with the local authority, possibly on the government's new community ownership fund, and ways of diversifying your revenue streams. As Raja's mentioned, advocacy letters, and putting kind of political pressure on local authorities played a big part in the work, but we also used, I guess some funders will be aware of this, local insight data. So that was kind of an easy way in which you can map a lot of available data on a particular neighbourhood and produce a report. And community organisations in the cohort found this really useful. They're just both kind of understanding, their kind of population and needs and issues and opportunities a bit better, but also for funding bids and making a kind of social value case for their community, community space. The kind of webinars kind of flagged the need for more peer-to-peer engagement. So we found by doing those webinars, there was a big appetite for actually those groups learning from each other, from talking to each other about the situation they were in. And I think more widely, we found this at Locality as well, that when you're going through such difficult times, the kind of the usual toolkits and how to guides kind of go out the window a little bit, because everything's fairly unprecedented. So just talking to other people who are in the same situation and are trying things, and some things are working, some things aren't, is just really useful. So I think we'll build that into the next wave, kind of space for that kind of peer-to-peer engagement. Okay, just getting into some case studies. So I'm going to talk about 3 that we were sort of directly involved in. Although in all of these cases, the Culture at Risk Office also played quite a big role, and it has been a really useful relationship, because sometimes with other kind of funders, we're sometimes contracted to do it and we're told to get on with it, and it's kind of fixed in terms of the amount of funds and days allocation that we have for this project. But what's been really useful about this relationship is that because the Culture at Risk Office are kind of directly involved in a lot of these cases, if we need an extra bit of money or an extra day here or there, or we want to continue that relationship, they're kind of pulling the strings. They kind of make that happen, and that we're just finding that really useful. If we're really getting somewhere with an organisation, and we feel as though a few more days is going to be really impactful, then we get it, and I think that's really useful. So I'm going to start by talking about the Lido Centre, which is in West Ealing. It's run by an organisation called Ealing Community Resource Centre. We had a few of these within the cohort. These are kind of your third sector hub buildings that have several, kind of community and voluntary organisations delivering services based there. And it's, you know, it had been a very successful sort of affordable workspace. A lot of the organisations there benefited from, you know, from having complementary services delivered from there, by having a kind of flexible space, by having a kind of, as I say, affordable rent. The landlord is A2 Dominion, who is a housing association that has some stock in Ealing. And so they're, you know, as a housing association, are quite sort of sympathetic to a lot of the activities that are being delivered there as well. The risk was the loss of income from tenants during the pandemic. It meant that the main organisation, Ealing Community Resource Centre, weren't able to keep up its own rental payments to the landlord. And also one of the main anchor organisations, Ealing CVS, was kind of, you know, pre-pandemic moving away from the centre permanently to a new location to be part of a community library. So they were losing one of the key organisations there in any case, and the pandemic kind of added to their woes. So the business support package was a combination of lease negotiations with A2 Dominion, coming up with a business continuity plan that's kind of looking at when they could reasonably expect tenants to come back, and what were their assumptions behind that. Could they create more flexible space, based on the possibility of a new normal where, office space won't be as needed as often or in the same way? To do that research on local needs, I think what we found through this work is that, A2 Dominion had this sort of sense that, there was a lot of good stuff that was happening here, but they didn't really have any data or any kind of information about it. And I think we were able to help the main organisation kind of compile lots of kind of very powerful information about the kind of combined impact of all of that, all of the services that were being delivered from there. And we're also kind of able to help them on kind of fundraising support as well. Actually, one of the things that we did do here as well, which kind of, shaped a lot of these areas, was to do a kind of a workshop on a balanced scorecard. And this is what we do an awful lot with organisations in this position, is to do a kind of a strategy on a page which focuses on, their organisational development, their business model, their financial, sort of income, and their social value, and to consider all of those four pillars in terms of what's happening now, what's happening in 6 months, or where they would like to be in 6 months, and where they would like to be in 2 years. And that's a kind of a quick way of just shaping, what a lot of their assumptions are, what they need to be doing. And then, that helps understand what kind of funding they need to access, what they need to do in terms of their board and staff development, and, what their thinking is going forward. And we did that with kind of several organisations. Okay, moving on to the next case study. This is an organisation called Suvai Deaf East Community in Redbridge. They're based in Ilford. They're a registered charity. They're well known by the kind of deaf British Sign Language community. Although they're kind of based in Ilford, their reach is a kind of much larger geographical area. So a lot of our cases were sort of hyperlocal communities. They've got sort of a geographical community, whereas this organisation had a kind of much larger, wider community of interest. It's a working cafe providing employment for deaf people. It does advocacy, a drop-in advocacy support service. It runs educational workshops. It has a deaf social club, which meets 2 or 3 times a week. So a range of activities supporting its community. But we came in at a crisis point. The organisation was close to closing the cafe, making its workers redundant, and obviously losing an important space for the deaf community. The landlord also wasn't a particularly sympathetic landlord, in terms of, wanting to keep the space going. the business model was working pre-pandemic, although it was a little marginal. As well as running it as a cafe, they were hiring it out for community events, and obviously the cafe income stopped, and the hire out income also stopped. And also when they reopened, you know, between lockdowns last year, it proved quite difficult. They'd sort of taken their staff out of furlough. There was less space available when they were making the space COVID secure. And it was also really difficult to encourage users, many of which lived far afield, to come and travel to come to the space. So they found that kind of reopening experience quite difficult and quite bad in terms of income as well. And in terms of how we supported them, yeah, again, a lot of kind of business continuity and planning, to give them a kind of realistic sense of when they could bounce back and what they could do to diversify and generate other sources of income. We also helped them because of their situation. Their rent wasn't particularly low or reasonable. We got them to look at other locations, and also the possibility of meanwhile use, and seeing whether the cafe could work as a kind of a more kind of footloose sort of meanwhile space, because we thought that might be a kind of an opportunity that comes out, you know, post-pandemic. The GLA supported with advocacy and building relationship with authorities as well. So again, we kind of work quite closely on this one. And then finally on to Haringey Vale Community Association in Haringey. It's based on the western side of the borough. Covers areas like Hornsey, Stroud Green, Crouch End. Quite a locally rooted community space, providing a range of activities and services, exercise, therapy classes, counselling, art classes, toddler carer, lunch club, community garden. And they get over 60 groups using it over the course of the year. Their risk was slightly different, and it kind of was their pre-pandemic as well. As one of those that it was exacerbated by the pandemic. They were in dispute with the council over quite a protracted period, and this was about their lease, and it was not helped by the council kind of changing its policy on how it works with community organisations in its spaces across the borough. So the council developed a particular policy in 2017, and Haringey Vale was a big part of the piloting of that. And then it got to cabinet, and it wasn't approved, and so they went back to the old policy, which was case by case. The organisation it works quite closely with other community organisations in Haringey, and from that they were getting the strong sense that they weren't getting a good deal from the lease that was being offered. They were comparing, you know, leases with other groups in other parts of the borough, and so they were a little bit aggrieved that because they were volunteers as well. They were a little bit exasperated and thinking about throwing in the towel. So I think in this case, you know, the council would argue that the space itself wasn't at risk because they wouldn't be evicted. The group were thinking of sort of giving it up because they were, as I say, all volunteers. And so that was the risk, really, that the organisation would disband, and it would be difficult for the space to get back to what it was doing, because the volunteers were an integral part of it. So I was directly involved in this one as the caseworker, and there was some early work done by the Culture at Risk Office on this, and my role was really to act as a sort of a mediator between the council and the group, and to get them to be in the same room to sort of talk about the terms of the lease. I found, actually, I was quite surprised that even though this dispute had been going on for 4 years, they hadn't actually spoken to the relevant council officers on it. So I think from the council's point of view, they hadn't been proactive in talking to the group, and from the group's point of view, they were in campaign mode. So they would go through the MP or the councillors, or go to the GLA and other funders, but they weren't actually aiming to sit down with the council officers to discuss it. So just getting them into a position where they were sort of talking to each other face to face on this was really important. And they are now making progress on, coming up with a lease that's kind of suitable to both parties. The council were very interested to learn that the group wanted to do to get some funding for redeveloping the centre, and that they needed the lease to be in a certain format for that to happen, and so they were very interested in supporting the group on that basis, because it would help bring inward investment into the borough. And I think the organisation, the group itself as well, got a sense that the council had some cautionary tales on where they'd given quite easy leases to some groups in the borough where there was no social value that was being generated in some of those spaces, so they had to think about being a bit harder on their kind of lease negotiation. So there was a bit more appreciation on both sides as to why it had been difficult. I think the other thing that I helped them with was looking at their social value. So how there was an assumption that the activities at the centre were all kind of paid activities, and yoga and all those kind of things that perhaps are nice but not essential in terms of sort of community services. And we were able to kind of dispel that really with data on the range of activities that were taking place and the kind of impact that was generating, and also that it was being used by a kind of a range of different groups in the community as well, young and old, people of varying ethnic backgrounds, different social classes and all the rest. So yeah, again, quite a positive sort of case study, and as I said earlier, this is also helped by an extension that we got from the GLA to sort of continue working with this organisation as well, which was really helpful. And I think in this case as well, because they were owing rent, we used the grant to kind of help them sort out that arrears issue first. So it's almost for some of these cases, we were helping that kind of short-term issue of an organisation being in arrears, but then using the business support as a kind of more longer term, so it wasn't a kind of sticky plaster that we were kind of focusing on them delivering or making an intervention that was going to be more sustainable.
So in preparing, I suppose, for this session, David and I were just talking about what some final thoughts and reflections would be. And I know that one thing that's of real interest to hear from other funders and the groups here is just about reflections on this kind of approach. I mean, what we found is, as David was just kind of clarifying, a small financial investment to unlock some really long-term solutions has been really effective, we have found, in terms of reducing the risk faced by organizations in losing the spaces that they need to operate out of. And it's a relatively small investment that I think has quite a big impact, and it's very targeted and strategic. And so, yeah, we're very open to hearing reflections on that and whether that approach has been taken by others, and also to think strategically about how to match up with other funders too. Had some very constructive conversations already with National Lottery Fund, for instance, about cases where we've done quite a lot of dedicated work with them already in terms of understanding what their needs are and what their challenges are. And we're very happy to share that information with other funders in order to support future applications and essentially smooth the ground or add a little bit more insight. It's been useful, I think, in COVID times when it's less easy to visit organizations and kind of get a better understanding of them for long-term funding. So that's my final thought. I don't know if you have any others.
No, I think you've kind of captured it well. It'll be, as I say, it'll be useful to kind of hear people's reactions, or read people's reactions, I think, in terms of the webinar format.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. Thanks, Roger. Really good to get that overview of a big program that's had a big reach already in a relatively short space of time, and has already started to achieve impact for the groups that you've been working with. So it's been really good to hear. I'm going to just try and stop your screen share, Raj, if I can. There we go. So we can see all of our wonderful faces as we get to the questions. Obviously, you've asked funders if they've got any feedback on the approach or anything they'd like to share. If you do, and you're watching this, you do feel free to pop that in the chat box or ask us a question that alludes to the learning that you have as well. There's already quite a few questions that are in the Q&A box that I'm going to be trying to work my way through in the next 10 minutes. So if we don't quite get to your question or we don't get to your point, we'll also share contact details so we can link people together as well. So I'm going to pick a couple of these, and I will end with someone who's asked a devil's advocate question. I'll use that as our end question in a bit. But if I just go through a few that relates a little bit more to the presentation, if I can. And there was one that came in, Roger, as you were talking about the sort of assessment process and the data piece. One of the questions that from memory came in as you were talking about that was about how you balance using data versus using community voice in making some of those decisions. And we've been really conscious that data is really important and a really valuable component of this process. But obviously, when you're talking about communities and you're talking about community centres, you talk about community spaces, you want to make sure the voices of people and what they need are heard alongside the data. So do you mind just telling us a bit more about how you balance that voice versus data piece?
Absolutely. What a brilliant question. I mean, it's come up a lot in our discussions. So I think the most direct way of answering that question is that we use it as data as a secondary approach, so not our primary approach. I think because we're aligned with the Building Stronger Communities mission, and we are really working to strengthen community voice and build community strength. We think that most importantly, we sort of focus on what folks are telling us and what organizations are telling us they need, and telling us about the kind of work that they're doing. And I think typically we verify some of that by using data. And we have the benefit, obviously, of being able to use information from our intelligence team and from the local insights tool that David mentioned as well. But ultimately, you know, data is data, and it only shows you what it shows you, and it doesn't show you what's not there. And we know that there's correlations between the kind of data that's missing because organizations aren't prioritized in research sometimes, or, you know, other things don't necessarily show up in the data. So yeah, I would say we use it as a supporting mechanism rather than as a primary decision-making tool.
Just to add in as well, that I mean, when I work with community organisations, and we have the local insight report, I'm very careful not to say this is going to tell you about your community, because they will already know their community really well, and a lot of the information that's presented in data is out of date. A lot of it is well out of date. So so I always kind of say in the context of, your community very well, but there might be some information here, particularly about the kind of population makeup and various other things that, that might just add to what you already know. So I think, it's important to, I guess what I'm saying there is that community voice is a data source as well. And then this other official data is just there to kind of add to what you already have. So
I think that's really important, and I think that came through. I remember, Roger, some of the conversations we had when we were setting the priorities for funding waves through the lens and community response. Actually, making sure reports like Localities, based on voice, were also part of the discussions that were going on at the beginning. It's all through the process. It's not just at the assessment part, is it? It's also how that voice helps to shape where the priorities are and where the attention gets drawn. So really positive to see how that's come through.
I mean, this program has benefited greatly from that work, because we were able to align around the London community response objectives and criteria, which I think was just a fantastic way to feel confident in a direction of travel that's been adopted by other funders.
Yes, and actually also thinking about how these things go full circle. There was a session, I think, yesterday that my colleagues Geraldine and Grace did, looking at how data was used during the course of the application process. So actually how data from previous applications, text analysis of what people were telling us in that was used to then inform future waves. So it's an ongoing process. It's binary. We've got this data set, that's it sorted, here's the decisions we'll make, and that's been really positive. And there's a couple of questions here that maybe slightly flow from there, which are about communities of interest or identity versus place-based communities. And obviously, you highlighted on some of the slides how funding had gone to groups that were led by and for, but there has been attention. And maybe if I combine two of the questions here in terms of the response here. But there's the how do you balance supporting communities of interest and identity versus place-based communities right now in terms of that sort of emergency need piece. But there's also a question that's been voted to the top by people about how we make sure we're addressing power imbalances in the future, recognising historically that some groups have not had access to the resources of others, particularly if you look at Black-led groups or LGBT-led groups, disabled-led groups, so the ones that have been prioritised through the funding you've offered this time. If that structural discrimination was there and those groups don't have access to assets, how do we make sure we're not just funding what's there, we're also sort of creating spaces for the future as well as what's at risk now? So both if you can take all of those questions in the round, Raja and David, and just give us your views from that sort of equity and justice space.
I mean, I would say that we've learned quite a lot through the crisis about how funding is enabled. So I know, from the cultural infrastructure side, the Cultural Risk Office also had a it's called the Cultural Risk Business Support Fund that launched right at the beginning of the crisis. And we were able to justify that spend based on research that existed. And, for example, we had an LGBTQ+ fund that was directed at LGBTQ+ nighttime venues. What we learned through the process of, the year was about other communities of interest that came forward and weren't getting the same kind of support. So this was the main onus of wanting to open this program out to wider kind of infrastructure and community infrastructure. So in terms of how to make that distinction, I think, again, it's really learning and listening to communities. So David talked about the Survive Deaf East community, and, when they told us about the challenges that they were facing, it really had to do with the fact that they weren't able to kind of register on the council as somebody that, as an organization that was a priority to fund, because their they served residents from the several other boroughs. So, with communities like them and with organizations like them that are so underrepresented in asset ownership and asset management, it's really clear that we have to dedicate some support to them because they're so few. And so we really try and tailor, I suppose, our decisions around those nuances and what folks tell us, and they know. Like if you speak to user-led organizations, they can say, we've had this many losses and there are this few spaces available to us, and it's not difficult to verify that. So I think it does take a little bit of, I suppose, additional engagement to get to that understanding, but folks know. So I suppose that's the main insight, is talking directly with the people who are applying and listening to that, to the fact that they're telling us that. I hope that was comprehensive. I don't know if you have anything to add, David.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think, yeah, I mean, there are lots of tensions. It's not great to answer a question that what the tensions, and say there are lots of tensions, but yeah, it's, I mean, I guess we're, for some organizations, we're talking about how can certain spaces be made more inclusive, and kind of understanding the population they serve and all that kind of stuff. And then when you're talking about communities that have communities of interest that have particular barriers, then it's more about safe spaces. So they're more exclusionary spaces that you're creating, because those are safe spaces, and that's because that community feels safer, and you can start that process of empowerment in those kind of safe spaces. So there's a real tension there, because which spaces are kind of hyper local and focused on a neighborhood, and therefore whoever's involved in managing that space has to make that's sure that space is welcoming to everyone. And then the other is kind of almost the opposite. I think just coming back to, I mean, the question about creating new spaces, I don't think that was kind of our remit, because we were about safeguarding spaces. So we were dealing with what was there, and safeguarding what we had, rather than thinking about it in terms of a Bright Ideas project of creating spaces where there were gaps for certain communities. But I think that that's definitely needed. That there was the Hawkins and Social Life report as well, wasn't there, about community spaces that talked about a lot of informal spaces, the barbers, and various other kinds of, sort of commercial spaces that take on that role of community spaces.
Yeah.
But also that sometimes the more traditional spaces can be exclusionary in themselves because they serve a particular community, so they can actually counter social cohesion, in some ways. So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to spaces, and and who commandeers them, and how they run, and all the rest.
I mean, I can also just add that I think in doing the analysis and talking to organizations, like, I feel really confident the majority of the folks that we supported were really, if their focus was really on being super inclusive and, being, available to all sorts of different folks, people from the community, they were included. But we also know that ones that were targeting specific communities, they were doing so for really important reasons, because those people otherwise wouldn't have access to space, or they needed culturally sensitive services in order to help make sure that they're, surviving the pandemic. So it really is a balance between each one, I think, and operating on a case-by-case basis, which is time intensive, but is the approach that we like to take.
Yes, no, thank you. I think being realistic, this fund alone is not going to address all the problems of structural inequality and discrimination that's been in the funding sector. But it's been interesting to see how, even within the context that you've been operating, you've been able to target resources to make sure that have the led by and for, as well as race dimension, and indeed both, have been reached by the funding. So that's been really positive to see, and we'll be sharing this learning, as I say, more widely. Conscious of time.
Sorry, and we'll be using the learning as well, I think, to help us inform policy making at the GLA going forward as well.
All these opportunities for this influence. It's fantastic. Thanks, Roger. I'm going to combine another couple of questions, then I'm going to end with the killer devil's advocate one, just for a sort of one sentence from you, from each. What the questions that I was going to combine are about funders that maybe are not as active in this space, how they can come alongside you. So some people who are funding services but that need the spaces, how do they make sure that their funding is aligning and amplifying and supporting the ambitions that you're outlining, and how do they make sure that they're capturing more than just what they maybe would traditionally be capturing? If they're funding a service, we know that community spaces also provide that reduced isolation, that positive experience, and that cohesion element. So how do we collectively make better understanding of what's going on, and how can we support these kind of endeavours as the wider funding community?
I think collaboration, I suppose, on maybe not direct, maybe funding programs in the future, but also maybe just understanding the pipeline of this program to other funds. So we, I think David mentioned that, our scope was focused squarely on safeguarding spaces, but that's not because we don't recognize the interest, obviously, of growing more spaces, especially for certain groups. And so we are really interested in sort of providing all the information that we've gathered on organizations to other funders and pipelining groups, so that there's a consistency of, I suppose there's a momentum of support, because we want to safeguard our investment, and we want to be able to work constructively with other funders to help them in their decision making. So any information that we can share in the future, we would be more than happy to, and we'd also be happy to look at partnerships going forward on how we can kind of align objectives and keep making sure that the organizations that we safeguard have a bright future and deliver against other folks' priorities too.
That's right. I will end with the killer question, which is the devil's advocate one that someone's put in, and we've got about 1 minute left of our webinar. So in one sentence, it's probably a fairly easy answer for you, but someone's asking, will there be such a big need for community spaces in the new normal?
I feel that David should start. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes is the obvious answer to it, as somebody kind of works a lot in this space. But I think during lockdown, and I live in East London, if we think about community spaces in its broadest sense, we're talking about parks, we're talking, about a lot of different, some of these kind of commercial spaces that I kind of referred to earlier, that people do want to, to go to places in their community and mix with others. And, when, we talk about the sort of death of the high street, and, are there other opportunities for people to come together into different spaces, and so it might not be a kind of traditional, the new normal might not be the same sort of traditional community centre. It might be different kinds of community spaces, but I think, yeah, now more than ever, definitely.
I also think that's also backed up by data, because we did find during the crisis that affluent neighborhoods that had strong social infrastructure but had a better response to the COVID-19 crisis. So I think even in the new normal, the emphasis on the need for continuous space is so important. And we heard from so many people too, who were just so concerned about the people that they typically serve and the isolation that they were facing, and the need for them to gather again together as quickly as possible. So I'm convinced there's a need.
Absolutely, yeah. It's good to end on that positive, that there is a need. We've seen really positive work that you've done over the last year to protect the spaces that were at risk, to make sure that need can be met for the future. We're hopeful that by sharing some of this learning, other funders will be keen to get on board with strengthening this further for the future. So huge thanks to Raja and David for coming along and sharing your expertise. Thank you all for joining us and for the questions you put in the Q&A box. Look out for the learning reports coming out soon, and look out for a recording on YouTube if you want to be able to share this session with your colleagues to spread the word far and wide. But for now, I'll draw the session to a close. Thank you so much again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. See you again at a Festival of Learning session in the next 24 hours. Bye for now.